Okay, thanks everyone. It's 9 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. And I'll do the introduction this time. Gabby after me do the introduction this time. So we're excited this week to have Dr. Alexandra Ramos Valle as our closing speaker. Dr. Ramos Valle works as a project scientist in the mesoscale and microscale meteorology lab at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. He also serves as the coordinator for the NCAR Early Career Faculty Innovator Program. Dr. Ramos Valle's research interests include modeling of coastal inundation using AI and machine learning, tropical and mid-latitude convective systems, and coastal residents' perspectives on relocation due to coastal flooding. Our academic path includes a bachelor's in physics from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and a PhD in atmospheric science from Rutgers. You can find some of Alexandra's recent work in journals such as Journal of Geophysical Research Atmospheres, Artificial Intelligence for the Earth Systems, and Earth and Space Science. So please give a warm welcome and attention to Dr. Alexandra Ramos Valle.
Thank you everybody for being here. This is a great crowd. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time visiting UF and it's been fantastic. I've had a wonderful time meeting with some of the faculty and with the graduate students. So, and as Kevin mentioned, I am the program coordinator for the innovators, which he is a part of. So that's how we met and connected. Also have met Christopher, who's a student in the innovator program. So yeah, thank you for having me. So I'm going to be talking today broadly understanding drivers of storm surge and coastal migration through machine learning. I'm going to be talking about like bits and pieces of multiple projects that I've worked on. I'm hoping that everybody can get maybe something out of it. I know there's a very like wide range of expertise and interest in this department. So hopefully you will connect and find some things that are of interest to you in one of these projects. First, I'm going to go a little bit into physics-based storm surge modeling. This is part of the work that I did for my PhD, kind of the last bits. And then we'll go into machine learning application for storm surge forecasting and machine learning application for coastal population migration, which I hope it's of interest to this group. And so starting from the very basics, storm surge is the abnormal rise of water generated by a storm above and beyond the predicted astronomical tides. So when we're talking about total water levels, we're considering storm surge, tides, and waves, as well as freshwater input. A lot of the work that I do really just concentrates on kind of the first three parameters, so storm surges, tides, and waves. And depending on the project and the research question, sometimes we actually do not consider tides, and I'll get to that in a second. So storm surge is one of the most damaging factors from tropical cyclones, and it is basically the main cause of fatalities from TCs. So highlighting its importance, it's really just right there, very palpable of TCs. In a more personal note, I'm sharing some pictures that either I took or my family members took, and this was after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. So this has always been kind of a passion of mine of studying atmosphere-ocean interface, but there's also this very personal component of actually having felt the effects of storms like Maria. And I was able to talk to the students earlier about this and mentioning how I went back to like my favorite beach and really seeing all the coastal erosion that happened because of the storm. It's a really, sad but also motivating factor to continue to study surge and TCs. My work has mainly focused on looking at the sensitivities of storm surge to different tropical cyclone characteristics. So I'm talking about like how large the cyclones are, maximum wind speeds, the speeds of translation, and that sort of parameter. Because storm surge is sensitive to basically atmospheric foresting. Atmospheric foresting is the main driver of surge. So whatever's happening in the atmosphere is really what you're going to see in terms of coastal flooding. It is also sensitive to coastal and geometry and bathymetry as well. And so my area of study has been focused on the Northeast US. mainly because I was doing my PhD at Rutgers. And so the New Jersey, New York area also has had its, major events, and that is Hurricane Sandy, that really kind of pushed the needle on our field. However, there are some issues with studying storm surge and TCs because of the limited records that we have for both of these, particularly for water levels. And that makes things a little bit difficult to us to study sensitivity to parameters and really question like what would happen if storms were a certain characteristics or the other. So part of our motivation was also thinking about Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy was really this event of like multiple factors combining together to cause this like massive record-breaking storm surge. And so some of that was the extent of the wind field, but also the near perpendicular angle of landfall. And while Sandy is really kind of a unique event, its estimated return period is about 700 years. It really, caused a lot of damage and started prompting the questions of, well, what happens if we have more storms like this? What happens if the tracks are shifting? And really kind of prompted us to try to study these scenarios. So really, Sandy revolutionized, I think, the field in terms of storm surge and how you combine the atmosphere and storm surge models to try to get sensitivity to parameters, as it really tested the resilience of the New York and New Jersey area. And so this type of low frequency but very high impact event are really motivators and highlight the vulnerability and the need for assessing sensitivities. So sensitivity to tropical cyclone intensity, size, forward speed, and angle of landfall. However, some of these parameters, in the physics of surge in general, are well known, but the sensitivity to each individual parameter and the combination of these is still kind of a big question. And so some of the parameters are more straightforward to determine. So the effect of intensity and size are pretty well known. The effects of forward speed are not that well studied and more difficult. So there's some controversy of what happens necessarily if a storm actually increases its speed or decreases its speed. And what we're trying to answer is also the angle of landfall. So a very idealized situation on what happens if you have the same cyclone just coming from a different direction. How does that affect the storm surge? So overall, what I've said is really there is a need for improvement in storm surge forecasting, which includes advancement of model coupling. I won't talk about that, but I'm happy to answer some questions and studies that we've done on that. But really, again, atmosphere is driving surge. So how do we couple these models so that they make sense, so that they are dynamic and can provide accurate information in a timely manner? Improved understanding of the underlying processes contributing to storm surge. And we will specifically focus on the sensitivity to the landfall angle. And then the development of approaches for both timely and accurate predictions. And that's where we'll go into some of the machine learning methods, in this case, neural networks. And our goal ultimately is really to understand the role of the atmosphere in driving storm surge and coastal flooding. So to do this initially, I'm going to talk just briefly about the modeling framework. So we developed a set of synthetic cyclones, about 200 synthetic cyclones, using the hybrid WRF cyclone model. This model is based on the WRF model, which is the Weather Researcher and Forecasting Model developed at NCAR, if you're familiar with that. In kind of very direct terms, the hybrid WRF cyclone model allows us to use both the idealized and the real components of WRF, so that we're able to spin up a cyclone with certain characteristics, literally cut the cyclone at any time step that we want, and then place it in the real world environment where it is left to develop dynamically, interact with its environment. And so why do we do that? This really allows us a certain degree of control over TC characteristics and allows us to really compare exactly what we're looking for. And so we get some degree of control by controlling the wind flow at the boundaries. So we did So we ran 27 different configurations, changing the initial tropical cyclone category, the initial intensity, the wind speed of the background flow, and also the location. So there's 3 locations so that we actually get that distribution that we want in different angles. I just want to note that these are not cyclogenesis locations. This is where we took the idealized cyclone and placed it in the real world environment. There is some spin-up time in the real world environment as well. So we do some filtering to try to, deal with instabilities that occur during the first couple of hours. And then the model just runs like a real TC would. This plot here is really showing, sorry, it's the 3 screens now. The plot on the right is showing the distribution of landfalls, which is actually consistent. We've made it consistent with the local climatology. For the storm surge component, now we have the atmosphere. For the storm surge component, we use ADCIRC, which is the Advanced Circulation Model. This is coupled with SWAN, which is a wave model. And in this experiment in particular, we do not include tides because we're trying to constrain kind of the interactions that are happening. But that is also possible to do. So ADCIRC is an unstructured triangular grid. So it has varied resolution, and this is done because these models are very computationally expensive. And so what we do to gain something out of it is have very coarse resolution in the open ocean where not much is happening or we're not interested in, and then very high resolution near the coast where we want to figure out what's going on. And so this mesh that I'm showing here was the mesh that was actually developed for Hurricane Sandy. So it's perfect for this area between New Jersey and New York. The resolution varies from like 80 to 500, but it has some areas, like the areas of interest were designed to have maybe like 30-meter resolutions. So it's actually pretty good. The extent of the mesh goes to the 25-foot elevation contour. So you're also getting, and that's why it's a little bit like closer here and broader in the south portion of New Jersey. So it is following the terrain of the area as well. Okay, so we have 200 synthetic cyclones, multiple characteristics, and now we're trying to group them, right? And so our initial attempt was to try to find cyclones that were very similar in their characteristics, so that were similar in their wind fields and their intensity and their size, but that made landfall at the same location. And so we did find a few cases of those within this ensemble, but I'm just going to show kind of the ensembles of the different, what we call directional analysis. So we decided that we were going to split the tracks into perpendicular tracks to the coast, or diagonal tracks to the coast, and parallel tracks. And this is the ensemble maximum storm surge that results from each of these. And so we immediately see some differences, right? The perpendicular, very broad range, impacts more area, also slightly higher water levels, specifically like in the area of the Battery, and this area here in South Jersey, which is extremely vulnerable. For the perpendicular, it's a little bit more concentric, so it is more focused on where the impact is and not as broad. And then the parallel tracks mostly influence the south portion. This is kind of obvious if you think about it. A lot of these tracks are actually running like through the coast. So there's all that interaction with land and they're debilitating basically, right? But we would expect something different and maybe perhaps more effects in the northern part if these were not tracks that actually make landfall, but they were just coasting through. So this gives us an idea of what to expect from these cyclones. And we've really expanded some of the work that's been done initially, really looking at what happens regionally versus what happens at individual stations. So try to look at the bigger picture. But then we thought, well, this is just how we decided that we were going to split the tracks. And so this was our first attempt at doing some sort of machine learning. unsupervised. And so we did k-means clustering analysis of the maximum storm surge. So while I'm showing here the tracks, the clusters are done on the storm surge levels. And so these are just the tracks that produce the storm surge for each of the clusters. And so what we see, first of all, of course, this one like pops up, mixed directional categories in some of the clusters. But what comes to mind immediately is also there's a distinction between the landfall location. So there's sort of a north-south shift between the clusters. And so what we're really interested in looking at is, which the k-means cluster does not tell us, is why are they grouped this way? So the k-mean cluster will try to maximize the difference between clusters and minimize the differences within clusters, but no idea of why they're like that. And so then we look at basically kind of backtrack and look at the atmospheric parameters as well. And so I'm showing here the maximum wind speeds or storm parameter in terms of latitude. The color coding is first, second, third, fourth cluster by these colors. And so what we saw, which I'm not showing here all the parameters, but we clustered them. We clustered for translational speed, we clustered for maximum intensity, pressure. Excuse me. The TCs are actually not clustered by cyclone parameters, so by those physical parameters. But we clearly see the distinction between location, right? So that's where the influence of bathymetry comes in. And so what we're seeing here is really that kind of interplay between there's an atmosphere driving everything, it's very strong, but then there's also things happening at the surface. And it's still kind of a question of how those two things interact with each other. So what we start seeing is really kind of a hierarchy of like the dynamic of power of who is influencing more, which is really not trivial to define. So far, I mentioned the use of the hybrid water cyclone model for the synthetic tracks. We saw the main differences manifested in the extent of the impact area and also the extent of the surge. And generally, TCs that are perpendicular to the New Jersey coast had a high inundation potential. And this was independent on whether it occurred north or south of New Jersey. And now thinking back to how the mesh was defined and basically how much a storm can actually flood based on the mesh extent. And then we also saw these sensitivity to the landfall angle and location, highlighting the importance of coastal features. And so I was asked today, how did I start doing machine learning? Which was a very interesting question, and I didn't have a direct answer. It was more of, this is the data that we have, these are the questions that we're trying to answer. Maybe this will help us solve it. And so we tried really using artificial neural networks to accurately forecast storm surge. So that was our first attempt. We looked at different lead times for storm surge. And then more importantly, and the part that really interests me is looking at the relative importance of all of these parameters in forecasting storm surge. And so for the application for forecasting, I'm also using the same data. In this case, the input variables includes TC location, so lat long, maximum wind speed, minimum pressure, radius of max wind, translation speed. Note that the angle of landfall is not there. It is very difficult to find a good kind of proxy for the landfall angle. That is not those that we like define in terms of being perpendicular, parallel, or diagonal to the coast. And so for the output, we have hourly time series of storm surge at 5 different locations around the New Jersey and New York harbor. For the purposes of the ANN, we do data splitting, so 75% is used for training and 25% is used for testing of the neural network. Prior to that, we also do the selection of ANN hyperparameters. And I might just kind of skip through this one a little bit. So we do cross validation, 10-fold cross validation to try to look at what are the parameters of that we assign to the neural network so that it is most effective, right? And so we looked at a combination of things. So we changed the number of neurons, we changed the lead time. So the lead time is basically the difference in time between the atmospheric forcing and when you see the effect of storm surge. And this is just kind of a test to make sure our neural network is like configured correctly. It doesn't really tell us a lot about like what's happening, but it's just a good exercise to do when you're doing these type of work. And so we finally settled on the third model, which has is a neural network with 2 layers, 100 and 200 neurons in each of the layers, and at a lead time of 2 hours from the for the atmospheric data within the storm surge data. And these are some of the results that we looked at, and this are particular for Atlantic City on the left and the Battery on the right. For the plots on the top, we have the AXER storm surge predictions, so the model predictions versus the neural network predictions. And you see it's doing fairly okay. There are some issues with the maximum storm surge that occurs for each event. And that is kind of a known issue in a way. One of the biggest limitations of machine learning applications and machine learning methods is really, it is only as good as the data that you train it with. And so our data has a certain characteristics. It is pretty conservative in the storm surge values that we're seeing. So of course the neural network is training on those, right? There are some ways to go about that. So you can do like oversampling of some of the larger values and so on. But we really, for this particular exercise, we just use the data as it was. But it's not all wrong. It does capture sort of the trends behaviors. And in this case, it captures double peaks. I want to point out that for this particular application, each time step in the time series was used as an independent time. So even though I talk about tracks, T1, T2, 3, and so on for 72 hours for each track are really used independently, so not as a full track. And the reason we did this was really to kind of cover more area, right? So certain characteristics in a certain point has this effect on the storm surge at the different stations, and a combination of those, which is this part here, right? So this part we said, okay, so what if you have the actual track? This will basically kind of gather it together. So it kind of sometimes makes sense and it doesn't. Like, why would you split it like that? And so you're kind of giving something to get something in return. However, we did try to tackle this problem as well. And so we also designed a recurrent neural network that was using LSTM. And that is the way that you really account for the time series. So in that case, we definitely use like the entire tracks. There was some slight improvements, particularly in capturing the peak values. But in terms of computationally, what you get, the improvement that you get is really not significant if we go from an ANN to an RNN. So then we go back to the part of, so which factors are the ones that are influencing search? And to do this, we look at different analyses once we have trained the model and looked at the results. One of those is feature importance, permutation importance. And the main question or the main guiding question is, how does the model performance change if I randomly shuffle one of the variables? And so this is done independently. So in this case, we have a model built, and then we take the pressure variable and just mix it. So we basically and effectively break the relationships between pressure and the other variables. And so the highest, and I've put them in order here of importance. So if it has a higher error, that means it's more important for the model, because it's when we break that, the model does not perform well. And so this is sort of the hierarchy that we were talking about earlier. Pressure comes up as the most important variable. So correlated with intensity, about 0.6 meter of error when we actually rerun the model. And then lat and long come into play. So that's our proxy sort of for landfall angle, and location. So we start seeing some of the same things that we saw earlier, and now kind of, in an order that physically makes sense from what we have seen. Another way to look at the importance is looking at sequential forward selection. And so in this case, similar to the permutation importance, but we're asking a different question. So how many variables do I actually need to construct a model that is accurate? And so in this case, what you do is you start building a model with one variable, and then you add the next. In this case, we see that perhaps like 4 variables would be enough to get the same accuracy that we're getting right now with our neural network of 6 variables, but just with the pressure, lat long, and translation speed. There are some issues with this when variables are highly correlated. So for example, pressure and Vmax. So Vmax actually comes up in the permutation importance and here as not that relevant, but this can just be a factor of it being correlated with the pressure. And so the model is really seeing this as, this is redundant. I already know this information, so you're not important. And that's where the physical interpretation of what we know in the dynamics really comes into play in trying to figure out what the machine learning model is doing. So going back to the questions that were posed initially, what is the sensitivity of storm surge to cyclone landfall angle? We saw that tracks that were perpendicular to the coast produce larger impacts, so broader area, but also higher inundation potential. And then can an artificial neural network be trained to make accurate predictions? Yes, provided that we have sufficient data, we have good data. And it's really important to get like a wide sample of scenarios. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some of these limitations are somewhat improved by the RNN, and it's really up to the user to decide if building the RNN, which is much more complicated to build and interpret, is worth the increase in accuracy. Okay, so that was kind of part 1 and 2, and now I'm moving to another topic. So we're not looking at the storm tracks anymore. We're not doing WAR for storm surge modeling. So as part of the innovator program, I actually collaborated with another faculty member. She's a geographer in Virginia Tech, Anna Maria Bovic. And she looks at relocation due to coastal flooding. So migration, why are people leaving? Where are they leaving to? And so I've made this comment a couple times. This is not my area of expertise. This is really, truly kind of an interdisciplinary and convergence driven collaboration where we shared similar interests in coastal problems. Anna Maria was really interested in running her data through a machine learning algorithm. And so we worked together to build something. And so Anna Maria performs a survey, a household survey of about 1,400 households along the eastern coast of the US, so going from Florida all the way to Maine. And so the survey asked questions on social demographic information. It looked at the sense of attachment or place attachment. So questions designed to try to understand like how close a person is to their to where they live. Exposure to flood events and consequences, and that include types of flooding. So was it storm surge? Was it nuisance flooding? Was it precipitation driven? What type? And then how often they experienced it and the consequences they experienced from this. So were they unable to go to work that day? Were they unable to make it to campus that day? And so our goal was to assess attitudes towards relocation. In this case, relocation, we're looking at it as a hazard mitigation and adaptation strategy when basically the resources of an area are limited and cannot handle how climate is changing. So I'm showing here some of the results that came from the survey. This is just the social demographic information. So the survey targeted, of course, areas along the coast. It had to be areas that at least 25% of its land was within the FEMA like flood zone. So these are people that are actually exposed to these types of events. And so what we wanted to do was really design a model using machine learning that could tell us a little bit of, so why are people saying that they would relocate or not? And so we decided to look at a random forest. These are the hyperparameters that we use. So the random forest is really kind of a combination of little trees. And it really uses the idea that we use in climate of an ensemble of models to try to reduce uncertainty. And so a little bit about the model itself. So during training, the model is asking basically yes or no questions until the data, it cannot be like partitioned any longer. And so the way that the random forest ensures sort of like a valid response and that it's actually doing the ensemble is by having uncorrelated trees. So that means that each tree individually will not see the entire data set. It's just seeing snippets of the data. And then the actual result of the random forest is a combination or average of all the individual trees. And excuse all the text on this slide. This is also part of kind of working at this interface where I'm like, I don't know how to show you what the questions of the survey are without actually putting them here. And so the way that we designed this is the input variables are actually the questions in the survey. And I will start by saying that, yeah, the questions in the survey are words, not numbers. I do not work with words. I work with numbers. And so we needed to find a way to change these questions. So like, what is important to you about living in your community? And this was related to things like social activity, proximity to my family and friends, proximity to my job, proximity to the ocean, community support. So basically what do you like about, being part of the place that you live? Similarly, what are reasons that you feel attached to your community? So that can be like the infrastructure, the fact that it is like a quiet zone, not a lot of construction, there's a lot of open space. What types of flooding have you experienced? Already talked about this, whether it was surge, precip driven, nuisance flooding, and then impacts or scenarios that you have experienced because of flooding. So like the property damage, people moving out. So is that something that's influencing your decision? And so we took all these input variables, about 67 questions that we had to basically encode and make them into numbers so that the random forest model can actually like read it and process it. And so by doing that, the number of inputs actually increases to about like 91, just because of how those questions were structured and how we had to divide them. But we do have one single output, and it's a very strict question of, would you consider permanent relocation should the flooding in your community become more frequent and severe? Yes or no? And so that's where we're trying to predict. First is, does a person, similar to what we did with the neural network, we have the input, we have the output, we train it, can we get accurate predictions? I just wanted to show here, this is a huge caveat in this study. These are the probabilities that the prediction will be yes or no. And so you see it's very skewed towards having yes responses. So the majority of the participants actually said, yes, I would relocate, which I think is very interesting because it's not a decision to take lightly. And of course, it really complicates things for people who are on the planning side, because can you actually take this like seriously? How do you plan around this? So it has many implications. I'm not going to talk too much about the model performance. We got performance close to like 85%, which is okay, probably not optimal. And so we need to be very careful that the results that we're looking at actually account for the fact that we don't have a perfect model. Similar to what we discussed with the neural network, we use feature selection to ask ourselves, what factors impact the decision to relocate? And so you can see here, the color coding here is purple for relocation-based questions, or those scenarios that I spoke about. Blue, which we don't have here, for exposure, green for sense of place, and orange for demographics. And so what's really obvious here is purple is up there, right? So what we're seeing is these relocation-based questions, it's relocation scenarios are really the ones that are driving, or the ones that the model is deeming most relevant. And so some of these are crime worsening in the community, if you see neighbors moving out, having low flood risk, experiencing 1 or 2 more floods per year, and just a wide range of parameters. We also looked at the Chi-squared and the mutual information feature importance, which basically looks at the dependence between the input and output variables. And this is just another way to ask basically the same question. So what factors impact a decision to relocate? This is kind of one of the things with using these models. The interpretation is not straightforward, so you really have to leverage multiple analysis methods to try to get at the response and increase your interpretability. And so what was good about these results is we're starting to see some things consistent, right? So some things are coming up, like the relocation-based questions are still coming up as most important, having the higher dependence between the inputs and the outputs. And then we start seeing and narrowing it down, like crime worsening shows up in all of them. Experiencing just one more flood per year, it seems like a kind of a tipping point for somebody saying, okay, I'm out of here. Being closer to certain facilities, having a low flood risk, business closures, and offered comparable housing in another location. So we finally are able to somewhat answer the question. So what are some of the common drivers among the 4 analysis tools that we did? We also did sequential forward selection, which I showed for the neural network, really highlights the relocation-based scenarios or questions as the drivers. Again, there is some limitation in how we interpret this. I would say that it's a little bit easier when we're dealing with the physical stuff, because we have physics backing up the relationships that we're seeing. And in this case, we're like, okay, so is this really something that will trigger relocation or not? However, the parameters that come up are concerns with crime increasing in the community, which I mentioned. This has actually been shown in other studies that have looked at crime and how that is a huge influence for people wanting to move away. We don't really look at what this means and how this is related to flooding. But you could probably tell there's a potential of when you have a disaster, and we've probably seen that in other avenues, like crime worsening because a lot of people have moved out, so it becomes a kind of a hotspot, or other reasons. That was really not surveyed, so it's probably a good thing to look at. Another one is the possibility of experiencing 1 more flood per year in the future. So again, it's like you're constantly having these events. So if you have 1 more, that's it. And I think we can all relate to that. It's like, if this happens again, then I'm not going to stay here. Another interesting one was the possibility of experiencing business closures due to flooding, and in a kind of lower degree, limited access to services and amenities, and being offered comparable housing elsewhere. So something to point out is that when we talk about relocation here, in the sense of this survey, it can mean moving from one neighborhood to the other. It doesn't have to be moving across states, moving out of the country. It's really moving from that place where you perceive risk to another where you do not perceive that you are at risk. And so this was such an interesting project to me. Again, not my area of expertise, but I learned so much, and I got a huge appreciation for the social sciences and the work that is done like directly with the community. And it really has like implications for future survey design. So now we know if we're going to survey again, what type of questions we have to ask. What are the things that people seem to be like triggered by? And more importantly, and very satisfying, is that the cross-pollination of social sciences with machine learning and more kind of physical side of things can be achieved because we tried it. It was difficult, many challenges and a lot of issues with how you interpret the data and how like how much weight you give to the results. I think I went a little fast, but that is all I have. And I'm happy to take any questions.
About the random forest one, sorry, on the social science. So you said that the only output variable was,
Whether they would relocate or not.
but it was whether they would relocate if flooding becomes more frequent or more extreme.
Yes.
How did you quantify that for them, or did you? Like, are they all imagining Sandy coming on an annual instead of a 700-year basis, or?
Yeah. I don't think that was specified.
Yeah.
And again, that's not, I was involved somewhat in the design of the survey.
Yeah.
But it was mostly in terms of how the questions were phrased and the data that I needed. So I'm not sure that that was actually like explicitly said.
That obviously would have an issue in terms of how they answer that question. Is very much going to be what kind of, how much worse does it get? How
What are
extreme,
you thinking
frequent?
about? Mhm.
And then I would argue that your crime outcome is completely independent of flooding, potentially, right? That if you have an increase in crime, whether it's increasing flooding or not, they're not going to want to live there. No one does. So that might also be mixed.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm a modeler, and I also appreciate the social scientists amongst us who ask all the questions that take years to get all these surveys up and running, because it's only when you do the analysis you're like, oh yeah, that could be meant that way or this way. So
yeah, I know. And I mean, I'm sure some people here can answer this question for us. It's like we are, and I did not do this part either. You know, Anna Maria goes out and surveys, and it is all within the context of flooding. And, you know, we don't have any control of what the person's actually thinking about when we say crime increases. Like, did you think about like the process, or it's just something? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I thought it was really interesting. I love
Yeah, there have been
Completely
things
biased.
related to it though. So there's some kind of
Yeah.
like backup in the literature, but
yeah, I work with a criminology person all the time, and they're like, crime.
I have a related question too. So there's looking at those different variables. So in migration theory, so you have push and pull factors, and sometimes the push factor is the pull factor. And so were those considered when they were looking at, you know, asking the questions? So like you had no or limited flood risk. So is that limited flood risk is a good thing to have? So that'll make them stay versus bad flood risk versus.
yep.
Because some of those, you know, you have them there as negatives and some are positive. So,
Yeah.
you know,
And
crime increases got low flood risk.
Yeah.
That seems like.
And
well,
mostly negative, and then just a bit.
Yeah.
I have to say, I tried to change the survey as much as I could, knowing my limitations in my place as well. Because I wanted to rephrase that and just have everything kind of as a negative or everything as a positive, because it was very difficult to interpret it that way. And I also have to say that not all of the questions that were in the survey were actually used for the random forest, precisely because of that. We have some open-ended questions to begin with, and so those are not used. There's no way for me to encode that. And then some of the questions just didn't like, it kind of makes sense with what the output that I wanted was. And so those were eliminated from the data set. And we also,
The other one was closer to family.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because that was one of the 5, I think the top 5 that came out. But
Yeah.
if you remove flooding, closer to family could also be something people move for with or without
Yeah.
flooding, or
Yeah.
away from, depending on your families. No, I'm not going to make statements. But yeah, so yeah.
those are all speaking to like place attachment. So it's like this place. So we're thinking more about broad categories rather than kind of the specific questions.
Did you have how long they've lived there?
Yes.
But
Mhm.
it didn't come out as the top
Nope.
variable importance.
No, none of the social demographic and like we like income, age, whether they rent or own the home. Yeah, it's a
Wow.
very rich data set. And I'm happy to share the paper that I published on this. I have all the questions that were used. And Anna Maria's paper is also like published. And she looks at all the questions, which I did not show. Yeah, it's
right.
very complicated. That's why I said it's giving me like kind of a new perspective, because how do you basically encode a person's perspective and we're working with like and we're working with human behavior and how do you quantify it? It's hard. Again, we take this with a grain of salt because most of the people, like about 80% said yes, they would move, but if they experience one more flood, will they actually move? We don't know, right? So
It would also been interesting to know when the timing of the last event that impacted them, because it's a huge range, right? It's from Florida to Maine.
Yeah.
So it would be interesting, like, are you getting, although 80%, you're not getting it, right? That's pretty universal, but it would be interesting, did it come on the end of a whole bunch of these events impacting them, so it's very fresh in their mind versus others? But yeah, I mean, it's amazing when things like rent or own and other things
Did
don't
not
pop
come
out.
out. Yeah.
It's very cool. You got questions?
I was just wondering, you showed all the results from yes for the same, the random forest. Did you look into what causes people to not want to move? So analyzing the no's, because I'd be interested in knowing, like, do the no's have the opposite response to all those? Are those all the same reasons the no's are staying or don't want to leave? Because I look at some of the predictors you have as being like predictors that, I know you said income wasn't a variable, but that only someone with the privilege to be able to say, oh, my house will definitely get bought, or I could definitely pick up and leave, that they could respond positively to.
So short answer is no, we did not look at that. And this is mostly because, again, the data is so skewed and we did a lot of things to try to like resample. And so what actually went into the random forest model was resampled data and balanced data set. So the proportions were the same. So the way that is done is basically you take the data that you already have and create some copies of it so that at the end you have equal amounts of yes and no responses. But somehow it still comes through in the model that is very biased towards yes responses. And so the random forest does very well predicting the yes, but poor job predicting the no's. And so the skills and the like false alarm rates for the no are very high. And so we really can't trust that. So yeah, this is one of the other intricacies of machine learning, which I mentioned. Like, it's only as good as the data that you have. And so you really have to get to know your data and what are the strengths of it before you look at any of this interpretation.
This is outside of your field of expertise, but you talked a lot about neural network stuff to improve structured forecasting. Do you have any sense of how that could be used in research to operations process? We could actually see it in weather service offices across the nation.
Yeah, that's a tough one because you still need data to train with. And so I think you're limited by what the data that you currently have, the accuracy of that data. And so how would you use it for, potentially this can be used. And I know there's a lot of work going on for models and parameterizations using machine learning, but for real-time forecasting, I mean, this is not a definitive answer, but you really just need a lot of data to be able to get over some of the limitations, like the ones that we saw with the peak water levels.
Okay. Thank you so much for a great talk. So just to kind of clarify about the survey, the respondents were like from Maine to Florida.
Yes.
So did you see any spatial patterns from their responses? Because I'm imagining like social media influencers in Miami Beach, and then you have like people cabin from a Hallmark movie in North Carolina. So I'm trying to figure out if the answer.
Yeah. It's a good point. We did not look at it. I think Anna Maria, so the person who actually did the survey, I think she might have looked at that a little bit more. And I'm happy to share the reference.
Thank you.
My question is going to kind of change the presentation. So you were talking about the direction of the fall hurricanes. Have you considered the relationship it has with the coastline orientation, which can also be important for wind fetch and more specifically for the contribution of waves, which you talked about, not specifically on this forecast.
Yep. And those differences come about when you look at where it's making them fall between like what we divided between north and south. And precisely because you have the wind coming along the bench line, which goes straight through New York Harbor, and that's exactly where you see the effects.
So I have a question. So you train the model, the artificial neural network to predict the storm surge with latitude and longitude.
Mhm.
So do they have any importance in predicting storm surge? Because for remote sensing, whenever we predict, like we train a model, we remove the latitude and longitude because they are like only decimal points. You don't have any values in the model. So in your study, I can see you use latitude and longitude as a variable. So
Yeah, and it does show up as one of the variables that is important for the neural network to get an accurate estimate. Like for your application, I guess you also have to think about what does that mean physically. So for this particular application, it's what we're talking about of like where along the coastline it's making landfall, how close it is to the coastline. So if it's very far, there's that relationship where, yeah, you're not going to see storm surge in the battery if the storm is like all the way out in the ocean. So we try to bring in some of that relationship of where the storm is in reference to the different stations. So I guess it just depends on what, like your specific application and what you're trying to do.
I'll ask another question about the forecasting. So part 1 and part 2, right? So your results from part 1 was that the angle of impact really matters in the storm track,
Mhm.
really matters for the maximum surge. And I believe in part 2, we didn't always get the peak right, but the angle of impact isn't one of the predictors of the model. And so do you think if you could improve that, it could improve your accuracy? Are you comparing model to model? So is it like, how good is your AdCirc model compared to your observations? And, you know,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about.
And these are all kind of work that has built up on each other. So we did not use a like landfall angle. We tried to calculate it, but then this issue of the orientation of the coastline comes in. Like, how close are we actually getting to this? It's very difficult to define an actual like angle of landfall, and that's why we did the K-means. Like, does something show up in relation to the angle that the storm is approaching land that we haven't like considered? And so what we use as sort of proxy is the lat long. That sort of tells us how close or far it is, how north or south it is. And that's just because it was kind of difficult. And we did try to calculate it for the storms, but it was just not a robust method to try to get like precisely what the angle was.
So where do you think your biggest gaps then in your forecasting prediction, that what you're not included in your neural networks that would help you potentially get better accuracy to your model estimate?
I think I would love to try this in a different region before even answering that question, because we're working with limited data sets. The way that we constructed the tracks is consistent with the climatology of the region. So we're not expecting a category 5 hurricane there. And so we're working with the limitations of basically being able to see storm surge that's not that large and significant. And so I think if we try to move this to a different area where we do have a wider range, it would give us a clearer picture of what's missing.
Yeah, another question. It's not my area at all. And you probably dealt with this, but high tide, low tides, are you able to incorporate that into the modeling? I mean, that makes a difference on.
Yeah. So in separate projects that I've done, mostly working with the storm surge of Hurricane Sandy, trying to simulate Hurricane Sandy to begin with. We did include tides because it was a major component as well. For the synthetic tracks, we did not. So, and this is mostly because we need to isolate the effects, and we want to isolate the effects, and adding tides adds another level of complexity where we're not really sure about the interactions, which can be kind of positive or negative. So we want to eliminate that. The simulations are not really tied to a specific time frame. We use a 10-year climatology for the month of September to categorize the area. So going back to the hybrid warp cycle model that I mentioned. And this is just so that we have an environment that hopefully will sustain the storms once we place it in the real world framework. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Question. So any attempt to sort of differentiate between the respondents in terms of risk? For example, some people may be risk averse, others love risk loving, others risk denying. And he, something what Jane said, you know, really what she did, to experience events, or you know, when was the last time you experienced that? You might get a sense of. So the whole idea of people want to be responding, you know, something like, well, it's the taxes that may be moved, or it's something else that may be moved, but not certainly not the floods. Because you know, I'm risk loving. I could care less about this. Or risk denying. You know,
Yeah.
oh, there's nothing. But did you get a sense to try to get in their heads in terms of their perceptions about
There was
based
an
on past experiences?
There was an explicit question on specifying the perception of your own risk. So like, what do you think is your risk? And I can't remember right now if we actually included it in the ML model or not. So I can get back to you on that because I don't really remember the distribution. But there was that question. And again, like I think Anna Maria really tried to frame all of it in terms of coastal flooding from different events. But yeah, these are kind of the nuances of this type of data collection. But that was one of the interesting things. I don't remember the results of that distribution, but I do remember the question of whether you as a homeowner knew if you had flood insurance or not. And that was very highly skewed towards no, people did not know if they had flood insurance or not. So there's a lot of information to get from it.
I'm not knowing if you have flood insurance or not. Someone who's born and raised in Jersey and therefore lived through Hurricane Sandy, the idea of people not knowing this kind of information, like, was there any other follow-up? I know it was a very extensive, thick description, like with income, socioeconomic status and things like that. So I wonder if there's any more detailed kind of information that maybe we should move from the model. It seems that information like that, which if you're in an area that's known for flooding and like New Jersey, if you lived on the shore, if you were to get any sort of support after Sandy to build a home, you were required to have flood insurance after that and put your house built and all of these preventative measures. So were things like that asked also in the survey, or is it more like were people in like Albany, New York being asked these questions as well as New York City? Like New York is obviously very different in flooding depending where you are geographically.
Yeah. So I think that was kind of like a two-part thing. No, the survey did not ask follow-up questions on that. It was just kind of an independent, and that's why I'm thinking, and I'm sorry that I don't know this off the top of my head, that we did not include it because it was a little, you know, we do some pre-work to think, is this question actually going to be relevant for this, the way that it's asked and answered. And your second question, oh, yes. So this is also a trade-off for ML models. We want more data to be able to have kind of a spectrum of responses. And so that's why we increase our area. So that's why we're here from Florida to all the way to Maine. It was initially going to be just New Jersey and New York area. However, it is constrained by what I mentioned of being in the flood zone. So you're expecting that these people have, you know, some sort of risk and are familiar with it. That was a question there.
What spatial unit did you consider to be in the flood zone? Like, did you just take a map and look at who's in the flood zone, or did you go by county? Did you go by zip code? Like, was it good?
Zip codes.
So
yeah.
it was the entire zip code was in the flood zone that was included, or part of the zip code?
At least 25% of it have to be in it. Yeah.
How did you drill down to your 1,400?
That's right.
How did the 1,400 respondents kind of show up from that? How did you reach out and get your sampling?
I was not part of that, but it was through Qualtrics. And so it's just sent to all these people. And so we're really dependent on getting responses. It
So
was
social media or?
no, I think it's just by email.
Email.
Yeah, but you kind of have to be signed up. I don't know a lot about this either. And that's part of the reason why we needed to increase our area, because we're relying on people from a very small region to answer these questions, answer them like correctly and truthfully. So there's quality control that goes through all the responses that we get. that reduces our sample size. Then we do our own quality control. So if you only answered part of the survey, we remove you. Some people just answer funny stuff that does not make sense. We remove those as well. And so that's how we ended up with a 1,400. So there's a lot of filtering that happens. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me.